Hi, this is Ed from 6 and welcome to episode 3 of You, Me, and the UKTC. This week we're going to be looking at conversion, mission 3, and also looking at staging as a concept. As always, you can follow us at 6 Gaming. That is the team Instagram, very active. And Edward F. Paints, that is my personal Instagram, very not active. You'll find me usually in a mad scramble a couple of days before an event, sometimes the night of. So, staging as a concept. I would define staging as a location that you can safely position units to interact with your opponent, to score you points, to set up things on the board that your opponent can't meaningfully interact with. Doesn't mean that you are sitting in a spot where they cannot reach you at all. It doesn't mean putting your entire army behind this massive L. That would be great. You wouldn't lose any models, but your opponents would get 45 on primary and probably run away with some secondaries as well. It means more your opponent can't meaningfully interact with you without overcommitting resources. So, for example, if I'm playing, let's call Space Marines, I've got units of Vanguard veterans in here, and my opponent's playing Tau. Sure, my opponent could send their full brick of crisis suits here, but if I've staged correctly, they're only going to get one unit of Vanguard veterans. It costs me 150, 160 points, whatever it comes out at, maybe less than that. And in return, I'm going to be eating their unit of crisis suits, which comes out at 350, 400 points. Not a great trade for my opponent. So the main part of staging that I think people struggle with is thinking ahead to the following turns. It's very easy to set up your models here and go, look, they're staging, they're in this point, I'm going to come out, I'm going to charge my opponent turn 1, turn 2, yada yada, nice and easy. But you want to not only think about what you're doing with these units, but you want to have almost like refill positions. So by that I mean you want to set up your units to go into the staging, ruins next turn, the turn after, and so on and so forth. So on this map, what that might mean is you've got 1 or 2 units here ready to come out turn 1, or sit there, put pressure on your opponent, make it so they can't meaningfully advance. You've got the edge on the board control. But you also want to have units perhaps in here ready to move forwards and take that spot. So when a unit here goes forwards, you can refill from there. You might want to have units in here to come down here. You might treat this area as a staging if you've managed to pin your opponent in their deployment, if they haven't got anything down here that can meaningfully interact with this objective. You might use this as a staging point. At that point, you definitely want to have something here so that you can refill that staging point. You've got to think a few turns ahead, not necessarily plan out every move, but plan out the reserve moves, because it's very hard for your opponent to disrupt that, where it's much easier for them to disrupt what you're doing with your active units that have gone out into the field. You also need to think about your threat ranges. It's all well and good to have, I don't know, a great unit, Terminators, Deathwing Terminators. It's all well and good putting them here and saying, oh, well, they're going to come down here and stage. When their 5-inch move and their advance only gets them to here, they're out in the open. Sure, they might not die, but they're also not going to get anywhere meaningful in this turn. The turn after that, you've got to position correctly. You also don't want to overcommit units. I think that is the difference between staging and just pressure, I guess you would call it, like a Goth pressure list. If you're playing orcs, sure, you're going to try and fit as much of your army behind these runes as possible to protect you from getting shot if you're playing against Guard or Tau or what have you. But I wouldn't call that staging so much as waiting in the safe positions to go out and put as many bodies in the open as possible. When I'm saying staging, I'm thinking more like a Van Vet army, Iron Hands. I think we're going to be seeing 10, 15, 20 Vanguard veterans, Space Wolves. I think we'll see a lot of jump pack units. I've just played on this map against Custodes that was playing very heavy into Venetari. I actually found that very difficult to play into as a shooting army on this map because they've got great threat ranges. It's very difficult for you to screen out. They can come out and touch you, repeatedly make your life difficult if you stage correctly. And you don't want to overcommit your resources. What you might find is you send out more than you need to do what you can. You might have units that are, left sitting in the open. You might have units that you've sent out and then you realize actually they're not going to make the charge because I've, put myself in a position where I need to roll an 8 and I haven't got any way of increasing that, making it more reliable. So you want to stagger your units, but not under allocate resources. And finally, what you really want to do is understand how you can interact with your opponent's castle. This comes in with thinking a couple of turns ahead, thinking about your threat ranges, your waves of units. But something, for example, that came up today is because these deployment zones are 9 inches from the center, 18 inches apart. That's only a 6-inch charge for a, well, I think it might be a 7-inch charge, whatever, a small charge for a unit that deploys on the line. The ruin overlaps with the line. I believe that means that you physically cannot screen out that corner by sitting just over an inch away, the way that is very typically done on UKTC boards. So you can definitely fit a 32mm base in there. You can maybe fit a 40mm. I'd have to see it in person, but I believe you can. That means that if you're playing a fast melee army, you can come down here, and if your opponent doesn't have any forward deploy or anything that can move pre-game, they've got no real meaningful way of screening out this corner. You can just come in and get an easy charge and then fight through the wall with the rest of your troops. Or you might want to think about how your opponent is going to struggle to bring their castle over to here, so you want to skew over to the left side of the map, tuck in as much as possible. It's a map that really rewards forward thinking in a way that I think some of the other maps don't necessarily punish you for. So conversion is a hold 1, hold 2, hold more. Very standard. It's a 5 objective map, and you get points for holding as standard. The end of turn tertiary scoring is you have 4 points if you hold your opponent's objective. Quite difficult to do given how castled up they will be around this little point here. It's 2 points for holding a central objective, one in no man's land, and you lose a point for not holding your own. On this map, I don't think that's particularly going to be a problem unless you may be playing against Super Tricksy GSC and they do some shenanigans, or you're playing knights and you want to get firing lanes with your Helverins or something like that. But most of the time, it's going to be fairly easy to hold that one. Also, if your warlord is not alive, then you don't get the CP at the start of the turn on the roll of, I believe it's a 1, 2, or 3. They've changed it. It used to be you just didn't gain any for the entire game, and then it's now you only gain it on a 4, 5, 6 in a dice roll. The thing that I want to talk about with conversion, because I think staging, once you understand the concepts of staging, I think this map plays staging almost by itself. That's not to say you don't have to play it well, but the logical way you play out the mission, play out the map, makes a lot of sense. You set up your staging units, you move to wherever you've decided to stage, you reinforce, rinse and repeat. And it is very much on the shoes of the player who is in the control position. Maybe that's a shooting army. Maybe that is just someone who's got, worse secondaries and really has to put the pressure on their opponent, but doesn't have the tools to do so. This map feels like quite a polarizing one if you do not have the tools to deal with a staging army. So how are you going to deal with a staging army if you're playing, for example, a shooting army? So as you can see here, from your deployment, if you're penned in, if you're playing quite safe, if your opponent's got fast melee units that you don't want to get caught by, you are going to struggle to get any firing lines. As you can see here, rough areas, these aren't exact. Your opponent can hide quite a lot from your deployment zone. So if they pin you in, they can be quite fast and loose with where they put their models. Even if you move turn 1, move up 6 inches, you're still going to struggle to get some firing lines. The overlapping, obscuring here means that this area is quite safe. These ruins down here make it very difficult for you to get line of sight. In fact, you've probably got a little bit more cover up here than you would do, and maybe a little bit more down there. So your turn 1 movement, even if your opponent goes first, it is very difficult for you to get line of sight as a shooting army into a staging army. If you want to get line of sight into the sort of safer positions your opponent has, the staging ruins, as you can see, you've got to have moved quite far, or you've got to commit quite close. So even here, your opponent can still tuck in quite a lot in here. If you want to deal with these ruins here, your opponent, you're going to have to move quite close to your opponent. You know, these lines of sight are not particularly favorable. So I would probably look at this game, make sure you've got plenty of units in your army that can screen, look at what resources you can throw away. But I would put as much as possible into strategic reserve without making it so if your opponent goes aggressive early on, you just immediately lose the game because you haven't got enough to fight off their initial advances. So strategic reserves, turn 2, this opens up some angles. It's not perfect, but if your opponent wants to sit behind here, you've got a lot of guns, they're going to be sitting tight. They're not going to be out here screening because then they'll just get shot. You can bring in units here. You can get some firing lines onto models there. You can shoot up this way. If you've got the range, you can shoot up there. Obviously, that's quite a long shot. You can maybe catch some models up here. Turn 3, I think, is where it becomes very difficult for your opponent to screen you out, especially if they're playing a melee army, especially if they're playing the trade game and they have moved their units forwards here. It can become difficult for them to stop you from holding or coming in at these points here, especially if you've got some sort of ability to come in closer than normal, a la GSC. So how would I be approaching this game if I was playing an army that had to interact with someone who had a heavy staging army? Plenty of Vanguard veterans, plenty of fast units that were going to come out and make my life difficult. First of all, I would not be playing around this ruin to start off with. That's something I learned today. It can put a lot of pressure on you. If you put units here, especially valuable units, you can lose them very quickly. It is very difficult to screen them out compared to on other maps where maybe the staging ruins are a little further apart. You feel a little more secure. I'd be looking as much endgame scoring as possible. By that, I mean stuff like aerospace targeting relays for Tau, which can be done, in theory, you could do all 4 at the end of the game. I'd be looking at stuff like, again, decisive action for Tau is great. That scored turns 3, 4, and 5. So you can play it slow early. Your opponent come out and put pressure on you. You can thin them out and then come out on your own terms. No prisoners, obviously a great one. It doesn't really matter when you score it. You're not losing pressure by not coming out and putting banners, for example. You can score that all in turns 3, 4, 5, turns 4, whenever it is that you commit. I would be looking to limit their primary. I might not be planning on racking up huge amounts of primary myself. Obviously, if you've got a forward deploy unit or a fast unit that can sit in here that you're not too bothered about losing, that's great. Be careful about doing that. You can give your opponent an easy way to slingshot into position. If they move their movement to here and then charge you, then they can hide. Sitting here is a little safer, for example. But yeah, so I'd be looking to limit their primary, knowing that I'm probably going to be getting 4s and 8s in the beginning of the game, and I might look to rack that up later on. I'd make sure that they're not getting anything more than a 4 themselves. You can't afford to just give them free primary in the game. Secondaries as well. You want to position. A lot of armies I've noticed at the moment are moving towards behind enemy lines. I think is quite an interesting secondary. Custodes, obviously a big up and comer in the meta. It remains to be seen whether that will last, but a couple of Valorous Terminators with behind enemy lines, it can be quite easy to screen that out while also staying fairly secure, especially if you're planning on moving out later on in the game against them. And I think the key thing that I would say is whatever screening chaff you've got, you're going to have to use some early in the game, but you don't have to throw it away. Try and save it for the turn that you're staging to come out yourself. For example, if I'm playing Tau and I'm planning on turn 3, making the most of my exploding shots from Carrion, I might use my screening chaff, sit it in here, turn 2, move it up to here, block my opponent so they have a much harder time charging me, move the big crisis brick to here, move the riptides up as well, so that when it comes to my turn 3, I can move out, I'm in position, and I haven't had my opponent come out and interact with me in a way that makes it difficult. This is a very interesting mission. It plays significantly different to how it used to. I'm very interested to see how it plays out. I'm looking forward to getting more experience on it. I think it's a great change. Weirdly, I think it makes UKTC feel a lot harder to play as a shooting army, especially because round 3 is usually around when you start getting paired into better players. If you've won your first 2 games, that's about the sort of time when you expect to see the familiar faces and playing to people who are definitely competent at setting up these staging attacks. So looking forward to seeing how it goes. I'd love to hear about your experiences on this map. Obviously, it's a new one. We haven't had much in the way of UKTC events this year since the pack has changed, but give me a shout in the comments if you've got any thoughts, anything that you would do differently, anything that you've noticed playing it.